Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 7 team selection. Today we're actually looking at a week where I've done something incredibly silly in light of the news that actually came out in the middle of the week, which was Bruno's suspension being overturned. Obviously, that suspension happened after I did something that was now, I suppose, in hindsight, very, very silly. We'll talk about that later when I talk about my Game Week 7 team. Before we jump into the video, I'd love to shout out Fantasy Football Hub. They support the content and they actually are a fantastic tool to help you increase your rank in FPL. You can actually have a look at things like suggested transfers specific to your team and even, for example, AI wildcards every week that actually show you some of the projected value of players over the next few game weeks. What I really like about Fantasy Football Hub is that there are multiple amount of tools. I even use, for example, Ben Crellin's calendar spreadsheet every week as well to sort of help plan my moves. And there's a fixture planner there as well, which I think is very, very helpful in terms of looking at expected points and things like that. So have a look at Fantasy Football Hub at the link in bio below. As far as Game Week 6, just quickly recapping that, we did wildcard. Was the wildcard team worse than the non-wildcard team? Absolutely it was. Do I regret the wildcard? No, because I don't really do regrets in FPL, and you guys know that. Am I still happy with the team as it stands? Probably after the decisions that I've made so far, yes, but Game Week 6 was really poor, right? The Bruno red, which was actually very clearly not a red, which we've mentioned, for example. And to be honest, I just didn't really expect that, even though we have really poor refereeing and also really poor overturning or implementation of VAR, and it's clearly very flawed in that we're not correcting clear and obvious mistakes. Got that Bruno -2, and Bumo Rogers did okay. Solanke scored, but the defense was completely flat despite really good fixtures for all of them. Haaland blanked, Saka blanked, so on. DCL as well. And the 50-50 decision that I had made at the end of the deadline absolutely was between Lewis and Guardiola. I don't really regret the Guardiola decision. I think a lot of people will mention that Guardiola is an extremely threatening player, and I think that's absolutely true, but I would completely contest whether Lewis has been anything but attacking this season. I think it was very justifiable to make that decision. Would I make such a call again? Probably I would. Of course, it depends on lineups and tactically how, let's say, someone like Guardiola gets set up, because sometimes we see him playing a little bit deeper. Sometimes you see something that was, I think, quite new, which was in the Newcastle game, his sort of unique position there. And as it turned out, Lewis and Guardiola were very much in very good attacking positions all over that game. But it wasn't the best of Lewis games, and instead Guardiola scored. And that's okay. That happens from time to time in FPL. Wasn't the greatest game week. Do we move on? We have to. In terms of the team, we got 34 points. I'm 2 million in the world. This is probably the worst start to FPL that I've ever had. Do I think that the season is over? Absolutely not, because we have so many game weeks left. And I've had wilder sort of boosts in terms of rank in the past, and I've jumped millions of ranks previously. So I'm happy with the team as it looks now, and I think that's the most important base. Is it a very poor start? Once again, I have to say yes. But do I think I can overcome it? I still think I can. And so we'll see how we look for this week, but that's Game Week 6. Now, looking ahead towards this week for defense, I think it's very useful to probably once again use what I would say is a very helpful metric in understanding whether we should make decisions at times, right? At least in the short term. So I can say already this week that I've done a hit. Was it something that I planned to do? No. Do I ever take hits after wildcards? I can't quite remember. I don't think so. Never. But with the information that I had at the time, I did actually take a hit and Trent was involved in it. So Trent is no longer in my team. And in this case, I'm playing Flecken this weekend. I'm playing Gabriel. I'm playing Lewis and I'm playing Guardiola. Lewis might not start this weekend because he's played a lot of minutes of football, and arguably Iwobi and Robinson is quite a tough right flank to deal with. Is it possible that Lewis can still start if Walker plays? I think so, because we've seen actually for all the games that Walker started the season, that Lewis has started as well. The only game where Lewis hasn't started was actually versus Arsenal. And would I really classify a team like Fulham to be like Arsenal, particularly when Man City are playing at home? Probably not. I do think that this is still a game where there's a good chance that Lewis can play. But is this also another game where he's got a good chance of getting benched? Yes. Do I hope to get some deadline leaks? Yes. And that's sort of the team stages this week when I did a hit. Did I do it before UCL? And do I recommend anyone taking hits before UCL? Not really, no. But I had also sort of taken players who were involved in UCL out of the team into players who weren't involved. And I felt a little bit more comfortable there. And I was trying to chase some price rises whilst also trying to avoid some price falls. And that's sort of where my team's landed. In defense, I actually picked up Leif Davis, but he will be on the bench, and so will Dunk. And that's ultimately the team, right? Gabriel, Lewis, Guardiola, Flecken, these players all have really good fixtures. Right now, of interest, I would also say that within Arsenal defense, you have players like Calafiori, even Timber, if his muscular issue isn't actually long-term or even significant in the short term, have become really interesting picks, particularly over the likes of Saliba and, of course, White, who's out for now. And then when it comes to Man City defense, doubling up on Man City defense now doesn't look as great, I suppose, because you, of course, have the optionality of moving into someone like Foden if you can predict his minutes to be a bit better. And I do think that this is the stage of games where Foden is a very, very good pick. But am I still happy with the two defenders that I have? Yes, because both these defenders, I do think, are a step above some of their peers in terms of the offensive aspect of the game. We've seen Lewis have some great games so far. No clean sheets, though, but that will come, in my opinion, from Man City and a quality of defense like them, plus the 3 fixtures that they have in the interim. As far as moving out of Trent, do I regret that? Not really, because I'll talk about the structural shift in my team and why I was quite comfortable with that. Do I think Trent has a great fixture this game week? Absolutely, I do, and I'm going to regret it a little bit. So I think at this point in time, it's worth also looking at the midfield situation. I've got Rodgers, Mboum, Saka, and Palmer now. So I've taken a hit going out of Bruno into Palmer before the price rise, or the initial price rise of Palmer. I suspect that he might be able to rise again before the weekend, or at least, let's say post deadline. As far as Trent, I did take him out of my team. I brought Leif Davis into the team, someone who actually has really good fixtures over the next 3-4, someone who I'm actually pretty comfortable with being an auto sub potentially this weekend. If, let's say, there's some sort of situation where, very similar to the Arsenal game, Lewis doesn't play at all, doesn't come off the bench, hopefully Leif Davis can play, as opposed to, let's say, Lewis coming off the bench. If I enter a situation where on the deadline I start Lewis and he doesn't actually end up playing. And then in the midfield, as I said, going back to it, the reason why I've gone for Palmer is something I talked about within the cheat sheet video. Without Bruno and someone at that sort of price point that I was that enamored by, and arguably, look, there are a lot of good Spurs assets within the game, even some great Arsenal short-term punts. You have Martinelli and Trossard for game week 7 and 8 that look really, really appealing. But Spurs picks in the midfield, Kulusevski, Madison, Johnson, these are all quite interesting for the next 5, because ultimately the next run of games for Spurs are really, really good. And without actually having Porro in my team, arguably I don't need to necessarily, ignore the Spurs picks. But what I've chosen to do instead is actually go for Palmer. And Palmer doesn't have a great run of games after game week 7, but I still thought that game week 7 was so good, where it was one of those weeks where I was comfortable with the hit, as long as I felt that Lewis could play effectively over Trent in this position. And I had a strong enough defense, in behind, I suppose, with Trent leaving the team, to sustain itself over the next few game weeks when Liverpool don't exactly have the best fixtures, and I'm comfortable also going without Trent. So part of the consideration there is, whilst Palmer arguably has some tougher games, so does Trent over the foreseeable, and I didn't really mind making that move under the assumption that Bruno was suspended. Now, as it turns out, Bruno's suspension was appealed, it was overturned, and he's ready to play. Is it the case that United have been really, really poor and Bruno has looked worse as the games have gone on? Probably. And am I happy, I suppose, to have taken a hit for Bruno? Not necessarily, because as I said at the beginning of the video, it does feel like a stupid move with the news that came out, obviously, afterwards. I don't really plan to take hits after a wild card. I can't even really remember a time where I didn't roll after a wild card, but that's that. That's the decision that I made, and I'm pretty comfortable with it. And ultimately this week, I do think my team looks very, very strong, particularly in the midfield. All the players actually have lovely, lovely games. We have home fixtures across the board, and that's really, really nice. So looking at my team going forwards, in the attack to support this team, I've actually gone with Calvert-Lewin, Solanke, and Haaland. Calvert-Lewin has a good home fixture once again. Has he been really dull? Yes, but I think it's nice that at least he's matching the likes of Wood. Are other options propping up like Liam Delap? Absolutely. Are other options like Vardy, who had a pretty poor fixture last week, about to enter a good fixture turn? Yes. Do I think DCL is that much worse? Not necessarily, no. When I look at, for example, some of the bookies' odds, he's still someone who's very much favored, and we all know how poor of a finisher he is, but he's still playing a lot of football, still on penalties, and that's it. So I'm comfortable with him over this good run of games. That's probably as long as he'll see within my team. With Solanke, the Brighton fixture looks even better now with Van Heck being out, and I do recommend that a lot of people do consider going for maybe approaching what should be a double up or a triple up of Spurs over this clean run of games. As far as Haaland, he's clearly a big part of my team. I did make a point within my cheat sheet video too that actually I do think 7, 8, 9 is a great run of games for Haaland, and a lot of people who might be Haalandless now and have actually really benefited from not owning Haaland and, for example, have had access to, let's say, Palmer's Hall, Salah captaincies that have been really good. I do think that this is the run of games where if you have the free transfers to do it, this is a good run of game to jump on Haaland for 3 fixtures, as opposed to just completely ignoring him until game week 9. That's one way to go about it, but I'm sure a lot of people are still very much happy with their Haalandless drops, and they'll continue to persist without him, and I think that's totally fine. Myself, I'm actually, as a Haaland owner, looking at and looking forwards to, within this structure, rolling towards game week 10, towards something like a Mo Salah swap on game week 10, which would maybe pick up a João Pedro back into the team, take Dibbling out of the team, and just do a sort of straight swap there. Something that I've considered a lot also is making a move on game week 8 from Saka to Son. Because ultimately, when we look at some of the Arsenal fixtures, and someone could very much point out that Palmer has a pretty poor run of games after 7, I think the same logic slightly applies to Arsenal too. And if I was to make a choice between keeping Palmer and Saka within my team after game week 7, I actually think that the player leaving my team would be Saka, which is why I was quite comfortable with the idea of taking the hit within my team. This way, going forwards, if I do a move like Saka to Son on game week 8, I still have 2 free transfers hopefully rolled up on game week 8 where I can reconsider the move that I was talking about, which is to move off of Haaland on game week 10 after I enjoy the Southampton at home captaincy. So that's something that's really firmly in my mind. But clearly moving from Saka to Son and not rolling too many transfers before that probably means that I'm not able to sort of preempt issues that come up, and maybe it's too aggressive of a short-term move. I still like the idea though, because as I said, between Saka and Palmer, I don't think they have the best of games between like 8 to, let's say, 12. And so why not take the opportunity to maybe go Son and still take advantage of the next 4 games of Spurs after Brighton away from home. So that's something that I'm definitely considering, but I'm very much happy with the team for this week, and this is going to be the team selection. In the bench for this week, I'll have Davis versus West Ham away, Dunk versus Tottenham at home, and then Dibbling at the back of the bench versus Arsenal away. I might swap Dunk and Dibbling around. I don't think it really matters too much. It is very clear that Brighton looked much worse without Van Heck. That performance versus Chelsea was appalling. Whilst Palmer clearly is one of the best players in the world right now, I mean, that game was basically a gift, and Palmer really could have had more. That's how realistically insane that game was for Palmer, and how poor Brighton were deliberately in passing out the back. One thing I'll mention for this game week is that captaincy is a huge swing once again, and I think a lot of people will be interested in betting against Haaland. And I think, ironically, I'm not that keen on necessarily going for a Palmer captaincy over Haaland. So for captaincy this week, I would actually like to look at one of the sort of classic Rob T graphics. So if you've never followed Rob T, have a look at his FPL account on Twitter. It's Rob T FPL. And ultimately, the projected odds for Man City are very good, but they're nowhere near as good as, let's say, Arsenal's team scoring odds. What is nice, though, in terms of the captaincy aspect of things is you know that someone like Saka is still going to be an extremely creative player, and he's still going to have access to a lot of points, and that's going to be a huge benefit. Do I think that this is an opportunity to consider the Saka captaincy? Yes. And when I look at, for example, the Chelsea game, much less goals predicted, I don't really think I'm that keen on the Palmer captaincy here, particularly when Nottingham Forest have actually played really well on defense, even in particular, a great away game versus Liverpool, a very, very tough place to go at Anfield. So I think they've been really, really commendable this season. Probably the worst performance so far has actually been Fulham at home for Nottingham Forest, but I'm not going to, I guess, react too much on that. Simply put, I think this is a captaincy split between either Saka or Haaland once again. Saka just once again getting a lot of chances. And honestly, I suppose if you revisit that Leicester game, he had plenty of chances to get assists, and we saw as well bonus points or close to bonus points, even though he got nothing really on the tally. So those are the considerations I have right now, because I'd say there has been a slight tactical shift within Arsenal. They are playing a slightly lower block than usual, particularly with the absence of Odegaard. Do I think Saka has become a little bit more creative, maybe a little bit more goal shy? Yes, but I think we also need to factor in that he's a penalty taker. Arguably, I think maybe the chance to rest is a little bit here, even though all these players are going to their international fixtures. And maybe you can make the argument that everyone's just going to play a lot of minutes, because that's usually how things go before an international break. Do I think Haaland's probably going to get more minutes? Yes, and that's why I'm pretty much leaning for Haaland for this game week as my captaincy. As far as some of the other sort of key things to point out with some of the projected odds, City, once again, with really good clean sheet odds. This is hopefully a chance where we can get that second clean sheet of the season for Man City. As far as Arsenal, once again, another great fixture to invest into their defense. But then keep in mind that the swing is quite brutal for Arsenal too. Not necessarily Bournemouth away, but then just generally, I think the run of 3-4 games after that isn't exactly great. So whilst a lot of people might be considering topping up on their Arsenal players, I'm not so sure if I'd be topping up on defenders now. Whilst Calafiori and Timber look very interesting, I might actually save those sorts of transfers later down the line if you want to double on Arsenal defense and you haven't already made the chance. On offense, though, I can see the opportunity in terms of the short term being there because there aren't too many midfielders that I think are essential right now at price points of Martinelli or Trossard. When I look at, for example, my team, I've very, very clearly locked myself into a structure where I have Palmer, Saka, and the ability to move into Son. However, I am closed off for the time being from going for Foden. But I'm comfortable with Lewis and Guardiola in the interim. And part of that, I think, is because moving Trent off the team, I do need a strong defense. These are the strong defenders that I want to have. Davis and Dunk will hopefully fill in the gaps. Dunk, for example, has a good Wolves at home fixture in Game Week 9. Davis actually has some really good fixtures in between anyways, particularly on Game Week 8. So that's sort of what I'm looking forward to in the future. And then even in future game weeks, we might even get to play Dibbling on some weeks when Southampton actually have some really good home fixtures. They actually have things like Leicester at home coming up, Everton at home coming up. And I do think my team, touch wood, looks quite strong considering I've taken a -4. And that is the team selection.